only like 5 minutes, so whatever. You don't have to drink.
But
Whatever
I want
you
to.
feel comfortable. Okay. Good evening. Thank you all for coming tonight to this important panel on the topic of immigrant rights, detention, and advocacy in Pierce County. Is it not? Oh, okay, thank you. There are seats. We actually have a balcony upstairs. Some of us who work here still don't realize that. Yeah, so there's people up there already raising the roof, I see. So come join them. There's stairs in the back, so please help yourself find seats. Okay, so thank you again for coming. My name is Rachel Hirschberg. I'm an assistant professor of community psychology here in the School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences at UW-T. I do community-based and participatory research with immigrant refugee families and communities in the South Sound and teach classes on immigration and family development. I'm pleased to be moderating this event this evening. In a moment, I will briefly introduce our panelists, which will be followed by opening remarks from our Chancellor, Mark Pagano. I first want to let you know the format for this evening. So after Chancellor Pagano's remarks, we'll hear from each of our panelists. Each will have about 10 to 15 minutes. And around 7:15, we'll have about 20 minutes for question and answers. This will be followed by a reception, which will include Jimmy John sandwiches and some other goodies. And as you're in the reception area, please also observe some posters that were made by students in our Professor Beverly Natus's Art and Global Justice class on the topic of immigration and detention. So I also want to mention several upcoming events that might be of interest to you. They're on this slide. One in particular that I want to highlight is being put on by UW-T students, and it'll be focused on the immigrant experience at UW-T, and it'll take place May 2nd through 3rd, and it'll involve a legal clinic for students and community members, so please put that on your calendars. So our panelists tonight include Angelina Snodgrass-Godoy, who is the director of the Center for Human Rights at UW-Seattle. Annie Benson is not here, but will hopefully be joining us in a few minutes. She is the senior directing attorney at the Washington Defender Association. Next, we have Stephanie Duran, who's a legal advocate at Tacoma Community House. After Stephanie, we'll hear from Dimitri Kristic and his wife, Maria Chistova, who are affiliated with Advocates for Immigrants in Detention Northwest. I'll provide more detailed introductions about each of them once we begin. I also want to acknowledge our generous co-sponsors for tonight's event, the Center for Human Rights at UW-Seattle, the UW Center for Global Studies at UW-Seattle, and here at UW-T, the Office of Community Engagement, the School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences, and the Center for Equity and Inclusion. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Chancellor Mark Pagano to the podium.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Thank you. And thank you all for being here. I always say it's my favorite part of my job is to welcome people to events like this. This kind of event we have tonight is exactly what we do at your University of Washington, Tacoma. Now, of course, we teach students, but we like to do it in a way that engages them with our community, and we have them work on the issues that surround us in our community. It's community-engaged learning, so this is right in our wheelhouse. One of the things our president always says is what we should be doing as a university is shedding light, not heat. And I agree with her 100%, but sometimes a little heat, I think, is appropriate, and maybe we can shed a little bit of heat on this situation that we're going to talk about tonight. So we're really glad you're here tonight. We're really glad that you're part of this community and that you come to our campus. I would also like to thank the sponsors. We have very generous sponsors that helped Professor Hirschberg put this on tonight. So thank you for being here. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Rachel Hirschberg. She is one of our outstanding new faculty, and she's going to tell you a little more about how the program will work, and then we'll get right into it. So thank you all for being here tonight.
All right, so we will get started, actually. So our first panelist tonight, as I mentioned, is Angelina Snodgrass-Godoy. Professor Godoy is a Helen H. Jackson Endowed Chair in Human Rights and the founding director of the Center for Human Rights. She's also professor of Law, Societies, and Justice at the Jackson School of International Studies. She's a sociologist by training, and her research focuses on human rights in Latin America. Prior to her academic career, she worked at Amnesty International, and most recently, Professor Godoy has examined human rights and historical memory in El Salvador, and as we'll hear tonight, human rights violations experienced by migrants in the criminal justice system in the US. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Snodgrass-Godoy to the podium.
Well, thank you, Professor Hirschberg, and thanks to all of you for being here tonight. I'm very excited to be here. I've been in this auditorium before sharing some of the work that we do at the Center for Human Rights in the Seattle area with all of you here, but it's particularly important also to say how excited I am to hear from all of you about the work that you're doing here in the Tacoma area. It's wonderful to see so many of our faculty associates, that's faculty that are engaged with the mission of teaching and research in human rights from the Tacoma campus here tonight. And I'm looking forward to a discussion also with your community partners. So I thought I would begin by talking a little bit about the mission that we have at the Center for Human Rights. I'm very proud that we're celebrating 10 years this year, and I'll invite you all right now to our 10-year anniversary celebration, which is on May 23rd, I believe, at the Seattle campus. And I do hope you will all be there and consider yourselves fully invited. We need to do more to foster these kinds of connections across campuses. In fact, if I would disagree with one thing about the way that we're introduced, it's not that the Center for Human Rights is located at the UW Seattle campus. We're technically administered through the UW Seattle campus, but we're a tri-campus initiative. And we learn as much from our colleagues here in Tacoma and the community engaged learning that your chancellor spoke about, as we do try to foster that kind of work at Seattle. So without further ado, I thought I would talk a little bit about our work, what we call Human Rights at Home, which is a specific initiative looking at immigrant rights in Washington state and the human rights concerns that are raised in the enforcement of federal immigration law here in Washington state. In this area, as in all the areas of the center's work, our mission is to carry out hands-on research with faculty and students collaborating together, but in particular in collaboration with organizations on the front lines of human rights advocacy, whether those are grassroots groups made up of affected persons themselves, professional advocates, or anything in between, including policymakers as well. So we've been working on this area of human rights at home, looking at immigrant rights here in Washington state since roughly the beginning of 2017. And you can visit our website, and it explains more the 4 main areas that we are concerned about and seeking information about. That is to say, transparency about federal immigration enforcement in Washington state. It perhaps should alarm us to know that no one really knows, except for the federal government themselves, who's being picked up in Washington state, where they're being picked up, what is being done to them, and why. Nobody knows that information except the federal government, ICE, and they're not always forthcoming with sharing that information, and that itself is a problem. We're also concerned about due process rights for immigrants, equal protection, which is a key area that we're going to be talking about tonight, and in particular about troubling instances we have seen of apparent retaliation against human rights defenders. That is to say, leaders in the immigrant rights community who have experienced deportation and other forms of immigration enforcement as an apparent attempt to silence them for exercising their constitutional rights to free expression. This is a grave threat to human rights anytime we see governments trying to silence those who speak out. In the particular area of transparency, we've been particularly active because that's something that we hold dear as a center. It's a cross-cutting theme in all human rights work, but it's also something we've explored in other areas of our work. And so a great deal of the research that we conduct is using public information, public access to information laws, including at the federal level, FOIA, or the Freedom of Information Act, and in Washington state, using the Washington State Public Records Act. That's in fact where we got the data that I'm going to be sharing with you in just a moment. At the federal level, however, we've been very discouraged to find that both ICE and Customs and Border Protection have responded to our requests quite poorly, which in fact led us to sue them earlier this academic year in September 2018. So that lawsuit is still in progress. We also, in December 2018, presented a report to the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights in Washington, D.C. This is a primary human rights arm of the Organization of American States. This report was a particular, the title of it is Secret Police, and you can download it from our website also. I would encourage you to do so. It's a specific attempt to address these practices of secrecy, which I spoke about earlier. Not only the fact that the government is not sharing this information with the general public about enforcement activities, or when they are sharing it, sometimes they're doing so in a misleading or deceptive way. Their responses to our FOIA requests and those of other parties have been inadequate under federal law. That's why we're suing them. And then we are also concerned in particular about the way that access to information is thwarted through government activity. I can go more into these topics if you're interested in question and answer, but a key theme that I think we're seeing here and that we need to constantly be vigilant about as people committed to human rights is the importance of just access to information about what our own government is doing, whether it's the federal government or local governments. So under that general area of concern that I've outlined there about the practices of our federal government sometimes acting hand in hand with local government agencies, we are interested not only in looking sort of from the top down, if you will, look at practices of our federal government and how they affect us in Washington state, but also looking at ways that local governments sometimes funnel people up through this system, or the practices here locally can lead to these kinds of outcomes. And that's what led us to embark on this research, in particular regarding the practices of jails. It's because we know that around the country, this is a key way in which people enter into the matrix of deportation and immigration enforcement. As you see here in Washington state, it's about half of the arrests that are carried out in our state are actually the result of encounters through jails, right? About half. So what you're looking at here is a map that we made of ICE arrests in Washington state. And the point that I want to call your attention to by showing this to you is the diversity that this suggests of practices from county to county. So you'll see here, this is of ICE arrests per capita, per population in these different areas. It's not specific to jails, this is all arrests. But you can see that there's much more intense ICE enforcement in Grant or Yakima County than there is, say, in Clark or Clallam County. We need to dig in as researchers then to understand how these practices vary from county to county and examine what their human rights implications are. And I think it's particularly important to focus on this sort of bottom-up analysis of what's happening locally for two reasons. One is because that might be an avenue where we can pursue effective change. Now, I don't want to suggest we can't affect the policies of our federal government. I think we have a duty to try to do so. But there's also an important lever of potential change in local policy. And so if we understand better how local governments are funneling or not funneling people into this system, we'll be able to craft better policy. So that's number one reason. Maybe we can do something about it if we understand better what's happening locally. And second, and I think the report that we released today is a good example of this, sometimes by looking locally, we discover surprising results. Surprising in the sense that we have sometimes assumptions about what local policies are or which areas are immigrant friendly and which areas aren't. And sometimes those aren't borne out when you look at the hard data, right? There are many ways in which we bandy around terms like sanctuary jurisdiction or these things without necessarily having a clear understanding of what they mean in the actual practice. And so that's what this report is an attempt to do, the report we released today, and I want to talk about just briefly now. We are trying to focus in particular on the impact of the use of federal immigration detainers, and I'll talk about in just a second what that is, on detention in Pierce County. So why did we focus on Pierce County? Well, we're interested, going back to the slide I showed a few minutes ago, in the question of how jails, since we know that jails are one key point of contact, one key entrance or doorway into immigration enforcement, how they work. And we want to look at that in multiple counties, not just Pierce County. Pierce is, in fact, the first of what we hope will be a series of studies looking at other places in the state as well. In Pierce County in particular, 61% of those ICE arrests are through jails, and we know this through public records requests. So that means most people who are getting picked up in Pierce County is because they came through Pierce County Jail. So we want to understand how that's happening. And so what we looked at, again, as I said, we made a public records request for the records of the Pierce County Jail, and we examined, using statistical analysis, we examined the book in and book out dates of specific inmates, and we looked at them controlling for a range of factors, including the ones, obvious things, right, like the gravity of offense or the number of offenses, the race of the inmate, things, a whole series of things which I could answer more about in question and answer, or I would also encourage you to read the report to look at the nuts and bolts of the statistical analysis we performed. The findings are right here on the screen. So what we found was that jail stays for inmates in Pierce County Jail who had an ICE detainer were 3.7 times longer than for folks who didn't, even when we control for other factors. So that's why the report is called Unequal Justice, right? Because we're controlling for other factors. It is clear that the reason for this discrepancy is not because immigrants are committing crimes that are worse than non-immigrants or something like that. This is simply because of the way they are processed in the system according to the policies of Pierce County. We also found that Latinx inmates were overrepresented in the sample of those who had detainers placed upon them by the federal government. I mean overrepresented in the, as compared to the population, the percent of the population that is non-native born compared to other ethnic groups. So I want to talk just a little bit about what detainers are, just to explain what we're talking about. So ICE detainers are basically, it's basically a request from ICE to an entity that is holding an inmate, a voluntary request. There is no obligation under law that it be honored. So they ask a local jail to hold an inmate or to notify the inmate, to notify ICE upon the release of that inmate. Now, over the years, detainers were peaking a few years back. They're now beginning to be used more and more again. But we saw detainers, the rising use of detainers was stopped by a series of very important court decisions in multiple circuits around the country. Here locally, this Miranda decision, which I believe was 2014, is a particularly important one because in that decision, the court found that it was essentially an arbitrary detention to hold on to a person after they have, so whatever time they need to spend in jail has elapsed. It's not that it would be unconstitutional to hold them longer just because the federal government wants them on an unrelated immigration matter, right? So once that decision and others like it started to come down, some jurisdictions around the country started to say, okay, we need to pull back from doing this, from holding inmates longer, because ICE was asking them to hold people in jail 48 hours longer than they would otherwise do so. And so a series of practices, sort of a pastiche of practices, have been adopted by jails across the country, including Pierce County, to try to answer or resolve that matter. Today, what Pierce County does, and this is a very important thing to be clear about in describing our findings, Pierce County says, we don't hold inmates that additional 48 hours. We're not doing that anymore. And we believe that that's the case, that they aren't doing that anymore. But what has happened is that the fact that the detainer is placed in that individual's record and indeed is visible on the inmate roster alters their experience in detention in a series of ways which result in a longer jail stay. So let me just say that again to be clear. It's not that people are staying later because Pierce is not letting them go. It's rather that the way Pierce administers their detention from beginning to end is altered by the presence of the detainer, and that means they stay longer. So it's not that tacked on 48 hours, it's the very experience of justice, if you will, from beginning to end that is unequal, that is fundamentally dissimilar, and that I would argue, therefore, raises key equal protection concerns. It also raises financial concerns. Because who's paying for these longer jail stays? Pierce County. It's not ICE. Pierce County is paying for those longer jail stays, and when we calculated using publicly available records about the cost of a jail stay, we figured that for the period of time that we were looking at, which was from October 2016 to July 2018, over $1 million spent by Pierce County taxpayers to keep detainered inmates behind bars longer without accomplishing any public safety benefit. Let me just say that again. The reason those people are kept behind bars longer is not because they committed a more grievous crime. It's not because it's unsafe to release them in the determination of any judicial body. It's because the way that Pierce County is processing those people as inmates keeps them in longer. There's no safety concern keeping them in. It's just the way they're doing it. So Pierce County taxpayers are shouldering this additional cost without garnering any public safety benefit whatsoever. So why? I hope I was clear earlier in saying that it's the experience of detention that is altered. It's not that 48 hours tacked on that used to be the case. Well, the research that we did was really digging into the statistics of people's time in detention. So we didn't have a chance to go and interview people or do that kind of additional research. We hope we might be able to support that in the future. But looking at what other researchers have uncovered, we find ample reason to believe that's what's happening here too. And these are some of the findings of other researchers who have looked into this. For example, lack of access to pretrial release programs for people who are flagged by immigration. Lack of access to bail for people who are flagged by immigration. The complications that ensue in plea negotiations also lead people to spend more time behind bars, changed incentives in that entire process, and the lack of eligibility for sentencing alternatives. These are part of the reasons we believe that entire process is elongated. So what do we recommend as a result of this? Well, first, we think Pierce County should stop registering ICE detainers and making that visible to bail bondsmen and judges and others who interact with these inmates and appear, therefore, to interact with them in fundamentally different ways than they do to people who don't have that flag. You can go on the jail register today and see who has a flag for an immigration detainer. And this is changing their experience while they encounter the justice system. We should ensure, or Pierce County should ensure that judges are not considering the presence of the detainer when they're contemplating sentencing or bond or other matters. We also think Pierce County should stop notifying ICE when they have somebody that they're ready to let go. Now, interestingly, the county has responded in contrasting or contradictory ways sometimes to questions about this notification process. But one key thing that they often say, and that's legitimate, is we're not holding people and then handing them to ICE. We believe that that's true. However, if they let people go and they've told ICE they're going to be let go at 2 p.m. and ICE is waiting in the parking lot and they step foot outside of the jail and there is ICE, essentially the notification is the equivalent of a handoff, right? And those are key problems that we should be concerned about. We should also be concerned about the access that ICE agents have to inmates when they are in jail. Because that needs to be restricted in important ways. For example, in cases where ICE has obtained a court order and wants to speak to somebody, we would say that that's appropriate. But for ICE to have free access to any inmate at any time is a problem and may in fact lead, as we have been told, to oftentimes the flagging of particular inmates based on their imputed ethnic characteristics or even things as basic as their last names. Those are the people that get flagged with detainers, and that is a key problem. So I think I will leave it there, but thank you very much, and I look forward to any questions or comments in the question and answer.
I see Annie Benson is here, so our next speaker will be Annie Benson. As mentioned previously, Annie is the Senior Directing Attorney at the Washington Defender Association. The mission of the WDA is to provide support for high-quality legal representation by advocating for change, educating defenders, and collaborating with other justice system stakeholders and the broader community to bring about just solutions. Annie has collaborated with an array of colleagues, clients, communities, public officials, friends, and mentors to win individual justice, bring about systemic legal and policy reforms, and build movements for social change. She has litigated cases at all levels of state and federal court, taught at the University of Washington School of Law, and served on the board of numerous local, regional, national organizations, including the National Network to End Violence Against Immigrant Women. Annie has been honored for her leadership by various state and national organizations, including receiving a Distinguished Service Award from the Washington State Bar Association. Please join me in welcoming Annie Benson.
I always wish my mother were in the audience to hear that. Good evening, everyone, and thanks. It's great to see a good crowd to be here. I want to thank both Phil and Angelina for all of their work on this report. It's going to be so useful in our advocacy work that we're doing. So as the introduction said, I run the immigration project at the Washington Defender Association, along with my two colleagues, Sarah Sluska and Jonathan Moore, who are in the audience tonight. And the essence of our work is to actually work with public defenders when they're representing immigrants in criminal proceedings. Is there anyone from the Pierce County Public Defender here tonight? Oh, great. So we all should be giving them a hand. Here's to underappreciated public defenders. They are true heroes and sheroes of the work of public defense, of criminal defense, actually. And so I'm going to talk about tonight, I'm going to step back a little bit and actually give you some context, both for the immigration circumstances here in Washington, as well as some of the ICE enforcement circumstances and what has changed in recent times. First of all, how many of you were born someplace other than the United States? Okay. And how many of you are the son or daughter or child of someone who was born outside the United States? Okay, good representation here. That's actually about the equivalent of what the whole state looks like. So let's see if okay. So 25% of the United States population falls into that demographic that you all just raised your hands for. And there are about 44 million immigrants in the United States. And as you can see, 3/4 of them are documented, unlike what you're hearing in the major media these days. And in Washington, 1 in 7 people are not US citizens. And here's a breakdown of what it looks like ethnographically. So the majority of non-citizens here in the state of Washington, the majority of immigrants are actually from Asian countries, followed by folks from Latin American countries. And I really like this slide because it gives you a great breakdown, kind of a little bit of a sampling from around the state of the percentage of the population. And what I think is one of the most interesting statistics here is that more than half of children in Franklin County in eastern Washington are from mixed status families, where that means that one of their parents is a United States citizen and the other is not. I'm not going to talk too much about comprehensive immigration reform because it's dead. And it's not likely to be revived anytime soon, despite the desperate need for it. So what I'd like to do now is just give you a contrast of what happened under the Obama administration and then what's changed under the Trump administration that is exacerbating the information that Angelina and Phil and others have put together in their report. So in his first term, Obama got dubbed the deporter-in-chief. And woo, did he not like that. It just really didn't fit with his image of himself. And so advocates, there was a tremendous amount of advocacy around this. And in his second term, in the wake of this, he established what are known as enforcement priorities. He prioritized who the immigration officials were going to target for apprehension and deportation. And so you can see those priorities here. Interestingly enough, from these enforcement priorities, essentially undocumented folks who had not committed serious and violent crimes were no longer a priority for ICE enforcement. And the number of apprehensions plummeted, which was great. I'm sure you've all heard of the DACA program, right? Whereby folks, youth, people who were brought here when they were young were permitted to stay here. They were given work permits and they were promised that they would not be apprehended for deportation. One of the things you may not know is that President Obama also created the DACA program, which was for undocumented people who had US citizen or permanent resident children. So this would have extended the DACA protections to about 6 million people. Unfortunately, there were a contingent of conservative states that filed a lawsuit in the Southern District of Texas. And there was an injunction put on the DACA program, so it never went into effect. And just a little side note for those of you who are legal geeks, you know, when progressive people want to bring lawsuits from around the country, they bring them here to the Western District of Washington. And when conservative folks want to bring big litigation, they bring them to Southern Texas. Just a little interesting fact. The other really important thing that was happening under the Obama administration is they were terminating all of the private prison and detention contracts. So they were going to phase out private prisons, and that process was underway in November of 2016. And like many things in 2016, it's no longer on the table. As I said, because of these policies, there was a dramatic decline, and just in a couple of years, the number of deportations and ICE apprehension reached the lowest that it had, I believe, in 2 decades. I talked about DACA and DAPA. So prior to the election of President Trump, even though there wasn't comprehensive immigration reform, the Obama administration created really significant protections for people who were undocumented. And a lot of it was based upon the fact that there was the belief that there would be comprehensive immigration reform in the pipeline soon. That didn't happen. So one of the first things that the Obama administration did, you've all probably heard about the executive order that was known as the Muslim ban. Well, the other executive order that folks probably didn't hear so much about was the executive order that wiped out the Obama administration's enforcement priorities. It dramatically increased the number of Border Patrol agents. And it gave ICE agents the power to issue deportation orders. And rather than phasing out the private detention centers, there was an increase in those. Perhaps the most horrible thing in a long list of horribles was not only did they eliminate the enforcement priorities, but they made sure to come up with their own priorities. Which is essentially anyone who is suspected of committing a crime. So ICE agents are out there deciding whether or not you have committed a crime. And if you have, and you're not a US citizen, they're going to apprehend you and put you in ICE detention just because they suspect that you have been committed a crime. No probable cause, no judicial warrants, and additionally, anyone who is simply charged with a crime can be now rounded up. And pretty much everyone will be detained, as you, I'm sure, have heard. There's been a drastic increase in ICE detentions, but nowhere has that been more true than with people who get funneled into the criminal justice system. Yep, there's been a 40% increase. You know, ICE likes to say that, like, oh, we're going after the people with serious and violent convictions. That's not true. That number has barely shifted since the Trump administration took over. But the number of other folks who are getting rounded up and deported has increased dramatically. Even though it's unconstitutional to actually hold someone on an ICE detainer, the Trump administration actually issued a new form that still pressures local jurisdictions to hold people post-release for the ICE agents. Regardless of what their local policies and practices might be, Pierce County is an example, local sheriffs have been very clear that they are not going to do this because they know they're going to get a lawsuit if they do. You know, it is a perhaps provocative thing to say, but this is actually what's really going on, right? This is 21st century ethnic cleansing in the United States. Because as the Pierce County report also shows, that the folks who are being primarily targeted for this are people of color, and most of them are Latinx. So I just ask you to ponder the idea, and this is becoming increasingly commonly accepted, that that's what's really going on here. Okay, now some good news. How many people have heard of the King County Ordinance that was passed last March? So it was a really great thing. Councilmember Gossett stepped up, and through close collaboration with advocates and with the community, King County passed an extraordinary ordinance, which is the most radical progressive immigration ordinance in the country. So here's what it does. No use of any King County resources, not a dime of King County resources, are permitted to be used to collaborate in immigration enforcement. Nothing, no buildings, no law enforcement agents, nothing. In people who are brought into the King County criminal justice system, they can no longer collect place of birth information. And it's not just in the criminal justice system. All departments in King County, unless it's required under a federal grant for some type of resources that are coming through a federal grant, no one who is an employee of the King County government is allowed to ask people's place of birth. Place of birth is the essential key ingredient that ICE agents need to put someone in removal proceedings. It is, if you're not born in the United States and they get proof that you're born somewhere else, that's what's known as proof of alienage. And once they put you in removal proceedings, the burden shifts to you to prove that you are here lawfully. ICE is not allowed into the King County jail. There are no ICE interviews in the jail. And importantly, as Angelina was talking about here, really the key connecting point between local jails and ICE is when the local jail notifies ICE that someone's being released. That's not happening in King County. So I just want to take a moment because this is something really great. As I said, it is the most progressive ordinance that any local county or city has passed in the country. And now some better news. Not better news, also some good news. Currently in the Washington State Legislature, the Senate bill was dropped last week and the House bill got dropped yesterday. It's known as the Keep Washington Working Act. And the Keep Washington Working Act, if it passes, will extend those King County protections I just said all across the state. No jail will be allowed to do any of these things. No jail can do any of these things, right? How great is that? And it actually has momentum. We've been trying for 6 years to get this passed, and there's a lot of momentum now that both houses of the legislature are under Democratic control, and we have a Democratic governor. Folks are feeling really optimistic that this is getting momentum now. And we've been working closely with the governor's office, and the governor's office is going to step up and be supportive of this and help us move it through the legislature. So that's ending on a good note, and I am going to step down now, and I'm happy to take questions now. Okay, actually, I think I'll pass it off, and thanks very much.
So Our next speaker will be Stephanie Dodon. And Stephanie graduated from UWT in spring 2018. She was also the winner of our prestigious Chancellor's Medal Award at the time, which recognizes an individual who's been a consistent source of inspiration for faculty and students and has overcome significant obstacles in order to complete a degree. During her last year in school, Ms. Dodon worked alongside Sophia Boguk. Where is she? I don't know where she is. She's somewhere in here. Who is another UWT alumni, on the Displacement, Detention, and Reintegration Project, which is a community-based research project that is co-led by myself and Dr. Vanessa Deverich-Woodside in Spanish language and cultures. This project is a collaboration with 4 community-based organizations here in Tacoma: Tacoma Community House, Advocates for Immigrants in Detention Northwest, World Relief, and the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project. This project is now in its 2nd year and continues to be sponsored by the University of Washington Tacoma's, this is a mouthful, Strategic Initiative Fund and the Office of Research Collaborative Publicly Engaged Scholarship Program. Please join me in welcoming Stephanie to the podium.
Thank you, Dr. Hirschberg. I'm very pleased to be here today, and I thought I'd begin a little bit by saying about my background. I arrived in the U.S. from Mexico when I was 5 years old. My parents came to give me and my sister a better education, and even though I'd always been academically inclined, that was a really big motivation for me in my educational pursuits. I was a psychology major, but I took various other courses, which is how I met Dr. Deverich-Woodside, and I was recruited for the DDI project. The project for me was really interesting because it gave me the chance to work with people who had been in detention, which I hadn't had the chance to do, even though I'm an immigrant myself. It was really eye-opening and sad to just hear all of the atrocities that just happened in the detention center. And it's hard because you can't always really help, even though you want to. I now work at Tacoma Community House in the advocacy department, and I have a little bit more resources to use and to help people who have been detained, though not as many as we might like. We have a volunteer who visits people who are in the detention center, and even though that might seem kind of insignificant for the detainees, it's huge. To see a friendly face when they're just locked up, it's huge for them. And when we can't help them, we connect them to other community resources like Aid Northwest and NERP, because we really want to, help people as much as we can. So I'll say a little bit more about what we do in our advocacy department at Tacoma Community House. There are other programs at Tacoma Community House: employment, education support, and immigration support. In advocacy, we focus on providing people who have been victims of crime, such as domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, and other crimes. We provide them with free support in referrals to other community sources, maybe some safety planning, help understanding the U.S. judicial system and accompanying them to court. Language barrier is a huge issue for a lot of our clients, so we have a language line, and all of our advocates speak at least one other language, so that really helps us connect with all our clients. In addition to this, we also help people who have been victims of crime, when applicable, to apply for U visas or T visas, and we help them connect with NERP attorneys for asylum cases. In 2018, we served about 300 clients, almost all of whom are immigrants and refugees who all have experienced crimes. A number of these clients are detained when they call, and some of the reasons why they've called is experiencing sexual assault, physical assault from guards, and others just kind of want to see if there's any sort of help they can get because they are in an awful place. A lot of the times we have to turn people down because of our grant restrictions that only allow us to help victims of crime. So if there's someone who needs something but hasn't been a victim of crime, we're not able to help them at our agency, which is when we refer them to other agencies. Through both the DDI project and Tacoma Community House, I learned of a woman who submitted her asylum application in a timely manner and was wrongfully detained for a week for overstaying, and that was a mistake. So I'm sure that this is not the only time that this has happened, and this really should not be happening. And with some advocacy from our office and reaching out to some government members, we were able to finally get her released, but now she still has to report to ICE. She was first reporting to ICE every month, then they reduced it to every 3 months. Now it's down to every 6 months. But had she not been wrongfully detained, she wouldn't have to check in to ICE at all because her application for asylum is still pending. Another client that I've worked with through TCH experienced the crime in the Northwest Detention Center. And after a lot of persistence to Tacoma Police Department, we were able to get them into the Northwest Detention Center to take a proper police report because the Northwest Detention Center is privately owned, so it should be treated as any other business where law enforcement can enter and take a police report. So these are just some of the experiences that our clients have had, but it's really important to note that there are thousands of other immigrants and refugees being detained in the Northwest Detention Center who have no access to local resources or legal support because it's very expensive, and a lot of the times they're isolated and they don't know of anyone. They don't have family here. People get transferred all the time, and it's really difficult. So they still have rights. Immigrants in the detention center still have rights, and as an advocate, our team really does the best to try and help them exercise these rights as victims of crimes. And on a final note, as an immigrant myself, someone who conducted research with immigrants, and someone who works with immigrants on a daily basis as my job, it's really clear to me that there are a lot of misconceptions about who is detained, for what reasons they're detained, and what it's like in detention. So I'm really glad that we are having this panel, this discussion here on our campus that's less than 2 miles away from the Northwest Detention Center. Thank you.
Thank you. So our final panelists are Dimitri Kristic and Maria Chistova. Dimitri is from Ukraine and Maria is from Russia. Both arrived in the US in March 2018 and were detained upon arrival. They have gone on to speak about the hardships they've experienced during detention and during their journey through various detention centers in various capacities. Prior to migrating to the US, Maria studied English and Spanish, and Dimitri studied mechanical engineering and owned his own business in Ukraine. They have a 9-month-old baby girl, Alyssa, who has been the most well-behaved baby of any baby I've ever seen in my life. And she's here with us today as well. They also continue to support the work of Advocates for Immigrants in Detention Northwest. Please give a big round of applause for Dimitri and Maria, who I think can speak.
Good evening, and thank you for invitation. I'm former Ukrainian entrepreneur, and when a typical US citizen, when Americans hear Ukraine, they think it's somewhere in Eastern Europe. It's something like Bulgaria or Poland, something very close. But in fact, this country is more corrupt than Mexico, or El Salvador. If you check the corruption perception level by Transparency International in Wikipedia, you can find out that Ukraine is more corrupt. So I had a business. My business was illegally seized by the nephew of the deputy chief of Ukrainian intelligence. I started denouncing that. Then they fabricated a criminal case against me. I was traveling on business purpose from Russia to Poland, and I had a layover in Finland. I was arrested in Finland. There was international arrest warrant against me. I was subject to extradition. I was waiting for the whole process in Finland, in Scandinavia, and they refused to extradite me. Then Interpol admitted that the criminal case was fabricated, but Finnish immigration office is something different. They refused to grant me asylum, and I was subject to deportation. And I had Maria, my wife, with me. She got pregnant, and we didn't have any other option, because if you to go to any other country, you need visa. If you applied in one European state, there is a Dublin regulation. You can't apply in England or in any other European country. So the only option was go to Mexico and apply for asylum here in the United States. So we went to Tijuana, and it was March 16. Maria was pregnant. The belly was, it's 6 months or so. And we were separated at that point. I was transferred to San Luis, Arizona, and then from San Luis to Northwest Detention Center here in Tacoma. I had no idea about my wife's whereabouts. I didn't know. I wrote multiple requests to ICE. Where was my wife? Where is my wife? And they never answered, never. So she found me first.
And I was a detainee in Otay Mesa Detention Center, which is in San Diego, California.
Then I had a credible fear interview. I didn't have any lawyer, anyone. I just had papers from the Interpol, from Finnish court, and I had a VTC hearing with the immigration judge, James DeVito from San Diego. So it was on the screen. Trial attorney was against. She told that my wife is Russian, and Russia, there is no diplomacy between Russia and Ukraine. So that's not true. So she was allowed just to lie during the trial. But eventually I was granted asylum. The conditions in the Northwest Detention Center, in Finland I spent 1 year and 4 months waiting for extradition. And I know the conditions there, and conditions here, it's way different. ICE treat people like it's inhuman, degrading attitude. They just don't listen, they don't care. It was like 4 months. Then after I was granted asylum, I don't have anyone here in the United States. I don't have any relatives, friends, nobody. When I was released, thanks to Welcome Center, to Aid Northwest, there was an RV with the clothes, with all the things. Aid Northwest provided me housing, food. They helped me to find the job and to start a new life. And I'm very, very grateful to such organizations as Aid Northwest, World Relief. They helped me a lot, especially to Deborah. I don't know, maybe Maria wants to tell her experience about.
My experience is in a Californian detention. And it's slightly different from the detention here, or maybe in another state, because here you get released and there is an RV and 8 Northwest with food and clothes and everything for people who don't have family or friends. And in California, I was just released. And because I didn't have family or friends, I had to go to a Texan shelter. But they just released me on the nearest train station, and they gave me a week to come. They didn't care if I had money or a ticket or anything, so they just released me, and that was it. So they don't care about the detainees at all. And also, another difficulty, yes, ICE officer wasn't very friendly, and to be honest, I saw my ICE officer once on the very day of my release from detention. And I was detained for a month because I was pregnant. And he only gave me a paper, a notice of release, and that was it. That was the end of our communication. And all the multiple requests that I wrote to be provided the whereabouts of my husband, there was someone else's ICE officer who responded me. Like, there is a list of ICE officers, and each person is supposed to be referred to a different deportation officer, right? And mine was like this and that. But I saw him on the very last day, so someone else took his job to actually care a bit about my situation. So that was nasty.
Yeah, just wanted to add, I remember one situation when ICE officer told me, "Hey, Russian." First of all, I'm not Russian, and it's it's improper attitude. And my father is in Otay Mesa in California right now because he can't go back to Ukraine. He was together with me. We had business together in Otay Mesa, and he has artificial cardiac valve and plastic aorta. So he has special condition. He lives in the dorm with 8 people. They playing cards all night long. There is a noise. I filed a lot of complaints to a lot of emails, and nothing helps. So they just don't, we do not exist.
But also, I remember one more thing. It is very hard not to have family or friends and be a detainee who could take you for a while, because I also tried to find a sponsor like a shelter in San Diego, because going to Texas was very hard. I took a Greyhound bus, you know, this 36 hours on a bus. That was hard. And when you call from the detention center, everyone sees that it's like an unknown number, and they don't want to take it. So I had a list of shelters in San Diego, and I called each and every number, but no one would take the call. So the only shelter that would take me was a Texan one, and I had to write a letter to them, and they responded me back, and that's how I ended up in that part of the U.S.
And then I brought them to here.
And yes, and I would also love to thank Deborah and all the people from Aid Northwest and World Relief who helped us. And you know what? These organizations, they're like religious organizations, but despite of the fact that we're not very much religious, they helped us anyway.
So I want to thank all of our panelists. Can we just give them one more round of applause? So I think another important sort of bright side of all of this is the important community-based organizations here in Tacoma and throughout King County that really do a lot of work to help make sure the rights of migrants and refugees are protected. And some of you don't know about A Northwest, but it's a really important organization here in Tacoma that literally has an RV set up outside the detention center and greets people as soon as they're released and provides them with a backpack rather than a garbage bag, which is what they're usually given when they're released from detention, for their clothes, and helps them figure out where they're going to go next. And it restores a lot of the humanity that is often lost in the detention center. So Deborah was mentioned as she's the important volunteer coordinator for that organization, and the organization runs completely pretty much by volunteers. So that's a really important organization to learn more about if you're interested. So I just want to close with a couple comments from myself, and then I'm going to open up for questions. Hopefully there's some questions raised for you tonight about to what extent there is collusion between ICE and our police force locally, and as both Angelina and Annie mentioned, to what extent is it constitutional? Is it lawful? Why are we so different than Pierce County or than King County in terms of what's happening in our criminal justice system? If you heard about what was just passed in King County, and then you hear about the report from the Center for Human Rights, we have vastly different practices that are still happening here. So something to be thinking about. One idea that was posed this morning, we had a press conference here about this report, was that the proximity of the detention center here in our backyard in Tacoma might have something to do with the practices that are happening at some of the jails around Pierce County. So it's something to think about. As Stephanie mentioned, it's 1.5 miles from here. You can see it actually from some of the buildings on our campus. So, what are the implications for that as members of the UWT community, of the Pierce County and Tacoma communities? Just something to think about. So I'm going to stop talking, and I'd love to hear some questions from the audience. We have plenty of time. And I'm going to be passing around a microphone. I think, is Sophie here? Sophie, will you come and help pass around?
I just wanted to follow up quickly with regard to the Keep Washington Working Act, which I mentioned, because if you're interested, it would be so helpful to have folks who are here send emails to your legislators, which you can find on the legislative state page. You can also go to the ACLU and to One America, two organizations in addition to ours that actually have talking points up there for you. And so it's going to have a vote in the Law and Justice Committee in the Senate on February 12th. So if you are able to send information, a support, even just a 2-line email support to your legislator, that would be super helpful and a really small, tiny step that only takes 15 minutes that would be enormously impactful.
Questions? I was wondering at this point, if the legislature passed that bill, that would take care of the problem in Pierce County. Is that the correct understanding?
Well, as long as you don't count the ICE detention center, but yes, it would take care, it would essentially shut down the pipeline from jail to deportation, from jail to the detention center all across the state, which would be a pretty radical thing to do.
Questions?
I can shout. I was at one of the early demonstrations at the detention center, and I was impressed with how sterile and inhumane the whole situation is, the way it's set up next to the railroad tracks. People are housed in totally anonymous situation, and people in there have held hunger strikes to try to break out of their isolation. I wonder if anybody can tell us about the Russian who was allegedly thrown into an isolation cell with no clothes and very cold and committed suicide. I think there's really horrible things going on there beyond what we are aware of.
No, I just want to say that I heard about this story, and there was one friend of mine in detention center. He told me about, he's not actually Russian, somewhere from Kyrgyzstan or Kazakhstan, somewhere from that country.
From Eastern Europe?
Yeah, it's not even Europe. It's Asia. It's Asia. Yeah, he told that he committed suicide, but he was mental or something. So there was something.
Do other folks here want to respond to the conditions in the detention center? I mean, in a word, they're horrible, as you're hearing. But I will make a point that part of the reason the detention center exists is because the city of Tacoma allows them to be here and makes a lot of money off the fact that they're here. So great organizing. If you want to, there's the the Resistance Northwest, and also, you know, if you want to take up the torch of advocacy, putting pressure on the Tacoma City Council is a great strategy.
Thank you very much for your comments tonight. I don't know much about immigration law, and I just know it's very complicated. And we keep talking about, you know, comprehensive immigration reform is the panacea. What would the panel like to see? What are your priorities for immigration reform if you had, you know, your druthers? I'd like to hear that. Thank you.
Well, I mean, I think it's really difficult for an immigration reform to happen, but I mean, it would be nice. I think if even just the DACA recipients could have a pathway to citizenship, that would be nice, because they're just kind of in limbo. They're giving a work permit and, you know, they won't be deported, but it's still very limiting.
I just remember the story about hunger strikes in a detention center, and I know one story when the Russian guy was released. He spent 24 days on a hunger strike, and my friends, they spent like 15 days. They lost weight, but all of them, they lost their cases. So they were in appeal, in the stage of appeal, but nothing helps. So.
Top three things that I would put on that list would be a path to citizenship for the 11 million undocumented people, reform of the asylum system as well as the immigration court system. There is a backlog of 800,000 immigration cases of people who are in removal proceedings but not detained. That we're talking the people during the federal shutdown, people who had waited 4 years to get to immigration court and make their case before the judge are now going to have to wait another 4 years at least. So reform of that system, as well as a shutdown elimination of all ICE detention centers. And my delusional fantasy hope that I would like for comprehensive immigration reform is to actually change our foreign policy, because what you're seeing here, particularly from Central America, is the legacy of the Central American wars that we funded. One of my favorite statistics is that at the start of their civil war, there were approximately 6 million people in El Salvador, and our tax dollars spent $6 billion to fight that, to pump money into that horrible civil war. And we could have taken that money and given every person in El Salvador $100,000. So that's my delusional fantasy. Other folks?
I was just going to add one quick comment. So, as a psychologist, one of the things that we really talk a lot about is how what's happening in our virulent detention deportation system is affecting children and families. And we used to be a nation, it seemed like, maybe we never were, but that had a lot more respect for family unity in practice than what we have now. So, for example, pre-1996, you used to be able to get waivers for family hardship and such, right? And now having families that will be torn apart during detention deportation matters course not, right, at all, as part of your immigration case. So it would be really nice if that was a possibility, a practical possibility now for people during their immigration proceedings, and then also a pathway to citizenship, of course, from my perspective, yeah.
If I could just add something, I agree with everything that's been said here myself, and I might throw in other things. There's lots of things that we might like to see because the problem is so deep, right? But one thing that for me is non-negotiable would be that there has to be greater transparency about what's being done in addition to all of these things. So if I could just address the question up in the, I can't see the person who directed it, but the question about a man who committed suicide, right, in detention, and there's still been no clarity about it. Somebody asks about it, and we all look at one another, well, yeah, I heard about that. That's tough, you know? This is a problem that's happening across the country, right? There are deaths happening in detention. Oftentimes, although they're obligated to under law, ICE is obligated to report those detentions publicly, and they simply don't do it until the news breaks in the press, right? That's illegal, but it's happening, and it's happening every month, it's happening regularly. So we heard about that one because it was here in Tacoma, but it's happening all the time, and this is simply unacceptable. Where are the investigations of these things? Where are the investigations of, for example, the treatment of hunger strikers? These are precisely the issues that our center is currently suing because we have asked ICE for precisely that information. We've asked for information about the criteria by which people are placed in solitary confinement, the evaluations that are conducted to ensure that they should still be kept in solitary confinement week in, week out. We have asked for investigations about the treatment of people, medical neglect, all of these issues, and they simply don't answer. So whatever your position is on whether there should be a path for DACA or DAPA or whatever, it should be unacceptable to everyone in this room that this is being done with tax dollars in our name, and we are being told every day that we don't need to know about it. That's a secret police operating on all of our watch. It's a secret government.
You know, I'm curious from the questioner or from other folks in the audience, what would you like to see in comprehensive immigration reform?
Okay, well, I had a question before that. So I wanted to know how you address the dilemma of, as horrible as the Northwest Detention Center is, it's located in Tacoma where you have all sorts of resources like Aid Northwest with Debbie, thank you, and World Relief in Kent, which provides a lot of services, and a lot of church volunteer groups. If that were to be removed from Tacoma and put in Othello, say, where you would lose all those resources. So I'm worried whenever I hear everybody saying, get the Northwest Detention Center of Tacoma, I think, well, then you'd have the case where the person's let out of the detention center in Othello, say, and they're abandoned. And I really, as horrible as it is, I worry about unintended consequences which are worse for the detainees in the situation now. So could you sort of sort that out for me, please?
Well, you've raised a really good point, and it's something that there is debate and grappling with this very issue, because most often what would happen is we could only be so lucky that they would move it to Othello. Like the people in the Northwest Detention Center would likely be shipped to Louisiana or Texas or someplace much further away. However, folks in the detention movement are pretty clear that we've got to start somewhere. And the idea of part of it is building momentum in Congress to close all of the detention centers down. We don't need this. And as I shared up there, the Obama administration was in the process of ramping them down. It's outrageous. There's no reason to be detaining all of these people. The underlying reason that they're doing it is because people in detention cannot bear the circumstances, and so they give up their cases and they go home, right?
Hi, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the targeting of activists for deportation.
Well, I can speak to that, and perhaps others can as well. I would say that there's increasing evidence across the country that people who speak out about immigration enforcement and the human rights abuses that occur in that process are, when they are themselves in a situation that's vulnerable to immigration enforcement, increasingly targeted. So here in the Northwest, many people have heard the case of Maru Mora, who's a particularly outspoken activist and a leader of an organization called Northwest Detention Center Resistance. Her case is a very important one. She has been living in the United States for 20 years, I believe, or around 20 years. And when she started speaking out about the abuses precisely at the detention center in Tacoma that they came for her. And sadly, that conforms to a pattern that we see around the country. So it was a privilege for us at the Center for Human Rights to sit at a table at the Commission for the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights in Washington, D.C., alongside activists from Vermont, from Arizona, from New York, from multiple parts of the country who have had the exact same experience, that when they speak up, then they come for them or they come for their family. There's a really alarming case, the case of, it's an organization called Migrant Justice in Vermont, where there's very clear, and this is all thanks to very rigorous research using public records by activists and advocates in Vermont, that there was a deliberate attempt, or not attempts, to target that organization, right? This is an organization that has spoken out for immigrant rights, for example, in dairies across Vermont, to go after leaders of that organization one by one and target them for deportation. Some have already been deported. The man who joined us at the, his name is Enrique Balcazar, who sat with us at the table in the Inter-American Commission, was told, "You're next." Right? So it's a deliberate targeting. And why does that matter? It matters anybody who's targeted. It matters anybody who faces detention under inhumane conditions. It matters anyone. But it particularly matters that we listen to the voices of those who are immigrants and who are on the front lines of these struggles. So that would be my response to you, sir. I'm also worried about if we take away the detention center here in Tacoma. But I take my cues from those who've experienced those things, detention and the movement to end detention, and they want it shut down, and then I think that's who we have to listen to. So if we can't listen to those people because their very vulnerability is exploited to silence their voices, that's a core violation of the Constitution, and those provisions in the Constitution apply to citizens and non-citizens alike. Freedom of speech has to be at the core of what we stand for.
Hi. So you were talking about transparency as far as like the procedures that that ICE uses in order to, how do they determine someone be put on, suicide watch or solitary confinement? And I work for an immigration lawyer, so I see a lot of this firsthand. And we actually had one of our clients actually, they put her on suicide watch. So do you guys have any information about how attorney, because I know during that time our attorney wasn't able to contact her own client. So is there any information on how an attorney can access their own client during that time?
Go to federal district court and litigate it. That's probably about the only avenue that's available. I mean, and I think there is a decent case for challenging that, but as we know, advocacy with the Northwest Detention Center is not likely to get you very far.
I had a question on, there was a court case for the immigrants in detention to get a minimum wage. Where does that stand? And do you think that would have broad impact?
I think the litigation is still ongoing. Do any of my colleagues, Jonathan, Sarah, I'm sorry? Yeah, the litigation is still ongoing. And it's a little bit like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, but I'm sure that the individuals inside there, it would mean a lot to them. I mean, they would be, yes, it makes it more humane. So I think it would make a huge difference. And I would imagine that if I were in the ICE detention center, I would want minimum wage, especially since it's likely to be $15 an hour here, right? Yeah, plus back pay, right.
Well, and that money is also used for people to call relatives when they have the opportunity, right? So one of the things, and correct me if I'm wrong, A Northwest helps provide funds to people when they're detained to call relatives because it's such a vital resource. So it's really important to be thinking about what's it used for. So that's one of the things it's used for.
If anybody upstairs has a question, they can come down for the microphone and they can ask a question as well.
I wondered if you were addressing what I understand is a very strong difference between what the bond costs in the Northwest immigration courts and it does in any other part of the United States, because that is also a major deterrent. If, you know, and I'm not going to be able to give you the statistics, but I understand that the average is hundreds and hundreds of dollars or thousands of dollars more in the immigration courts here than it is in Texas or any of the other areas. Can you speak to that? And is there anything being done to address that?
Well, we have someone here in the audience who actually was a lawyer with the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, who works in the detention center, and I'm going to put her on the spot. Sarah, can you speak to that question? It's Sarah Sluska here, who's my colleague at WDA, and if we can slip a microphone over to her, I think she might have something to say.
So bond is given on an individual basis, and so attorneys every day for individual clients are arguing for the lowest bond possible. So there's not really a way, as far as I know, to systemically challenge the higher bonds here. It depends on the judge, and even in the time that I was there from 2013 to 2017, individual judges were setting higher and higher bonds, and we couldn't really figure out what that was based on. So it's a tough question. Yeah, I don't really.
And can you speak briefly to, you know, just what we're talking about when someone gets a bond hearing? First of all, like the amount, the dollar amount we're talking about here, on average?
So the minimum bond is $1,500. A judge does have the power to set conditional release without bond, but that's very rare. And there's no maximum. So the average bond, I believe, right now is around $10,000 or $15,000, and that's for people with either no criminal record or very minimal criminal record. And even for arriving asylum seekers, there are some people that are not even eligible for bond. They're subject to mandatory detention during their case, and that includes most people that are seeking asylum and turn themselves in at the border. Only ICE has the power to release them on bond, and they usually don't do that, at least currently. But the judge can potentially set a bond, and that was even $8,000 for arriving asylum seekers who are, you know, have strong cases and have no criminal background. So it's even harder for people that have any kind of criminal history.
And just to be clear also that unlike criminal proceedings where you're granted bail and you can go to a bail bondsperson and, you know, if you have a $5,000 bail, which actually is not very frequent unless you have a serious felony, you can put up 10% of that. But in immigration proceedings at the detention center, it's only cash. So if your bond is set at $10,000, you got to come up with $10,000 cash.
So I'm a teacher here in Tacoma, and several years ago, Tacoma Public Schools came out and said, Tacoma schools will be a safe place for our immigrant students, that we would not cooperate with ICE in any capacity. But I'm curious whether or not other school districts statewide or even nationally are targeted by ICE, and whether there's any statistics on ICE detention of students.
So part of what you're speaking to is that there under ICE process or under the guidelines that ICE has been given to follow, schools are what's known as a sensitive location, right? Schools, churches, hospitals are designated sensitive locations. Doesn't mean that ICE can't go in there and apprehend people, but they have to, essentially, they have to go up a chain of command that makes it a little bit more difficult, and they have plenty of other targets. So, and also the PR is really bad for them when they do things like that. And we have an attorney general here in Washington State, Bob Ferguson, who actually issued guidelines for hospitals and schools in particular for how to put policies in place that will help to protect non-citizen kids and parents in the school system.
Hi. Oh, shoot. So something, oh God, that I was worried about is frequently you see that the Northwest Detention Center is located on a Superfund site. That is another thing that is nationwide, where there are frequently, like, not only detention centers, but also prisons or jails that are located close. Any sort of incarceration is located close to or on a Superfund site. Is there any research that is being done into how these Superfund sites, which may be a possible 8th Amendment violation under cruel and unusual punishment, or is there any sort of research being done as to how long-term damage is affecting the people that are incarcerated in these places, in these Superfund sites?
I'm not aware of any. It's a great, it's a problem, and I would imagine that by the time folks have the long-term consequences manifest, they will be long gone. Yes, but it is on a Superfund site.
It is a good question for the Pierce County Health Department, though, I think, as well, yeah. I think we have time for maybe one more question, and then I invite everyone to join us. Oh, maybe 2 more questions, and I invite everyone to join us for a reception afterwards.
I just wanted to go back to the bond amount that Sarah was talking about. So a colleague was at Northwest Immigrant Rights Project. So we got news today that a mother who was separated by her child at the border, detained at Northwest Detention Center, son went to Florida. She got denied bond, and then she appealed to the Board of Immigration Appeals, and then the Board of Immigration Appeals said that the judge had to grant her bond, and so she had her bond hearing today, and the judge gave her $15,000, so 15,000 for a mother who was separated by her child at the border.
Okay, I see Deb has a
question. Hi, this was more just kind of a comment. I'd really highly encourage everybody to keep generating these questions amongst themselves and amongst the people that aren't here, the people who couldn't make it. And then really kind of going off of what one of our panelists said about directing these questions not only to the people here at the front, but also the people who are running the city. And that can look like anything, really. Just a couple weeks ago, we were at City Hall, and there's just like a group of grannies, like really sweet grannies, and they broke out in a song. I forgot what the tune was, but they broke out in a song, and they changed every lyric to be just awareness about the detention center. So I guess it can be facts, it can be hard facts, it can be monetary facts, whatever. But I think making sure that our council is aware and knows that our community is talking about this, and that we don't want it here, or at least want some type of change, really resonates a lot. And so I would encourage everybody to go. It's every Tuesday at 5 p.m.
I'm just going to jump in here because what you're referencing are the Raging Grannies. Mm-hmm. People know about the Raging Grannies? They are a group of elder women all across the country, and they have groups in cities and counties around the country. And this is what they do. They take familiar songs to people, they twist around the words relevant to a particular cause, and then they show up. Were they all in their get-up? They usually have hats and boas and awesome dresses, and they do that. So here's to the Raging Grannies.
Deborah, do you want to make the last comment or question?
Yes.
So last comment right here. We'll just.
Microphone, probably. Okay.
I just wanted to say that the Washington Immigrant Solidarity Network is holding a advocacy day on February 5th, and they're trying to get at least 250 people to go. So that's in Olympia at the Legislative Building. So Aid Northwest is going, and if anybody wants to go with us, let us know.
Thank you to everyone, and thank you to you for staying for this. Please join us for a reception afterwards. Thanks so much.
Oh yeah, everything's out there. Yeah.